We'd gotten down to the bottom of that first page. Just to recap briefly, and by the way, these forwards to each of these editions are very important for your sponsees to read, especially the first and second edition. There's material here that you find nowhere else in the big book. For example, on the top of page 13, on forward to the first edition, we of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. It's so important for your sponsees to understand this, that we're talking here about recovery from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, and that this big book is a compilation of the experiences of those 100 people in reaching a state of recovery, so that when we read the book, we're not reading a bunch of philosophy or somebody's opinion. We're reading about the actual experiences of those who wrote the book. And there's a major difference between this and some of the stuff that's floating around out there. These people are saying, looky here, this is what we did, and it worked for us. And we sincerely believe that it will work for you. And here's how we did it. And we're going to lay out for you exactly, with instructions, how to go about recovery. So when we pick this book up, when your newcomer picks this book up, they have to understand that what they're reading is the actual experience of those who wrote it. And that this book was written, as it tells us here, to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered. The word precisely is not in there by accident. It means exactly what it says. Precisely, the precise instructions for working the 12 steps are contained in this book. Nowhere else. Nowhere else. Except in the 12-step guide for sponsors that I wrote. The reason that they're in there is because that follows the big book directly. I've never seen any other literature which does that. But we don't have to do anything but pick up this book to know what the instructions are and what we are to do for recovery. Keep in mind also that because this book is showing the newcomer precisely how to recover and how the others, ones who went before him or her, recovered, it ought to bring them hope. And hope is one of the most priceless things that your new person can have. Because as this says, when we come in, it's with a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Now let's go down to the bottom of the page. We're going to see down here the beginnings of the traditions. Remember, this foreword was written in 1939. The traditions were not adopted until 1950. And Bill wrote out all 12 of the traditions in 1946. So that here we see, in the early stages, the beginnings of the traditions. We are not an organization in the conventional sense of the word. Well, that is an understatement of the year. Because this Alcoholics Anonymous isn't like any other organization, with the possible exception of a few other 12-step groups which try to emulate us. We don't have an organization. Nobody's in charge. There are no rules. There are no laws. Nobody can enforce anything anyway. Everything that we do is voluntary. Everything we do is in the direction of the unity of the fellowship and carrying the message. That's why we do this. And in the process of doing this, we stay sober ourselves. There are no membership requirements except the desire to stop drinking, and that's entirely internalized. That's not something anybody can pry your head open and check out to make sure whether you are or not, whether you have that desire or not. So ultimately, it comes down to this. You remember when you say you are. And nobody can challenge it. So this is pretty important stuff. Right off the bat, they say this: there are no fees or dues whatever. There are no organizations I've ever heard of that don't have fees or dues. Try to become a member of this club without paying your dues. It won't work. As far as I know, they don't have any scholarships here. So if you want to be a member of this AA club, it's a separate corporation, non-profit corporation. You must pay your dues. Not for AA. You get to have a whole brand new life in recovery from a deadly disease for nothing. Zero, zilch, no money at all. Whatever we contribute, we do that on our own volition. The only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. One of the few boo-boos in the big book is putting honest before desire, because it's either a desire or it's not a desire. The modifier honest has no power, no meaning. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. Now, there isn't any other organization anywhere, except possibly some 12-step organizations, which are that absolutely wide open without any written qualifications at all. So we begin to see that we're looking now at the seventh tradition and the third tradition. We're not allied with any particular sect, faith, sect, or denomination, nor do we oppose anyone. That was repeated almost verbatim in the what we now call the definition, which was actually in 1944 was written in order to obtain special mailing privileges from the post office. And they require that you define yourself in some way. We simply wish to be helpful for those who are afflicted. And then they opened the door. We'll be interested to hear from those who are getting results from this book, particularly from those who have commenced to work with other alcoholics. We should like to be helpful in such cases. Inquiries by scientific, medical, and religious societies will be welcome. That's important too, because you see, AA has never taken a position which would in any way denigrate or tear down or run contrary to other organizations of any kind, religious or scientific or medical. It's not our place at all. We cooperate with all these people, but we do not in any way attempt to modify them, or we don't criticize them. And of course that's now expanded to such things as the prisons and the recovery programs of various types. We cooperate with all these people. Never once expecting to be able to do anything other than to carry the message. Notice also that in 1939, there were about 100 members in 3 groups. Now you're going to see, as you read these forwards, the growth of the fellowship. And by the way, I'd like to make this clear to you. If you have a newcomer, or even somebody who's been around a while and hasn't bothered with the big book, these forwards are must reading. Absolutely must reading. That's why when we give the book to a newcomer, we tell them to read the whole book. Not your sponsor's expurgated Reader's Digest version, but the whole book, because it was written for the newcomer. Now the forward of the second edition was written in 1955. And if you take a look on page 15, XV, from 1939 to 1955, the second full paragraph, from 3 groups, it was now 6,000 groups with over 150,000 members. When I came in 1964, there were approximately 200,000 members. and about 8,000 groups. We're going to learn a little bit later in the forward to the third edition that by 1976 there were over 28,000 groups and over 1 million members. Today, the numbers are well over 100,000 groups and well over 5 million members. Now, these are important numbers for a lot of reasons. First of all, this is a graphic illustration of the power of the 12 steps. Because at the heart of all of this are the 12 steps. Without the 12 steps, we would not have a program of recovery. Two vital requirements. One is that the program is based upon one alcoholic working with another. One-on-one. As we learn later in this chapter 7. It's you and the new person walking hand in hand on the road of spiritual recovery and spiritual growth. Two people. That's the first requirement. And the other is the 12 steps. These two things are essential. Without them, there'd be no program. Group action without the 12 steps is useless. We are not an encounter group. We are not a psychological group. We are not group therapy. And service to the group by means of ashtrays and coffee making doesn't keep anybody sober. Coming to meetings without working the steps and without carrying the message to others one-on-one doesn't keep anybody sober. Some people stay around for a long time, but eventually something happens and they have no protection against it. And so as we read this forward to the second edition, we have to recognize that these few pages constitute a capsule review of the entire growth of the fellowship. And if your sponsees never read AA Comes of Age or Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers or any other AA literature, if they just read this forward to the second edition, they will have a very good idea about how the fellowship started, what its antecedents were, and how it has progressed since then. For example, let's go down to the bottom of page 15. The spark that was to flare into the first AA group, this is XV. The spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck in Akron, Ohio in 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician, Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson. 6 months earlier, the broker, Bill Wilson, had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend, which was his friend Ebby, who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day. See how compact this language is. I mean, it's all it's all very dense, because in those few sentences we've already gotten a flavor of everything that happened prior to Dr. Bob and Bill getting together. That's Bill Wilson, had also been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism, who is now accounted no less than a medical saint by AA members. And his story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. Dr. Silkworth should have had the Nobel Prize in Medicine for the work he did in producing for us his medical opinion of alcoholism, because he hit it right on the head, and he was way ahead of his time. It wasn't until 1964, 62, somewhere in there, that the American Medical Association decided that alcoholism was a disease. Dr. Silkworth called it a disease back in 1939. From this doctor, the broker learned the grave nature of alcoholism. Though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford groups, he was convinced of the need for moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief in and dependence upon God. Now, if you look at that one sentence, you see how many of the 12 steps are contained there. He was convinced of the need for moral inventory, step 4. Confession of personality defects, step 5. Restitution to those harmed, step 9. Helpfulness to others, step 12. Necessity of belief in and dependence upon God, step 3. Step 6, step 7, step 8, step 11. And you say, whoa, wait a second, there's one step missing in this. Step 10. How come? Well, we're going to find out how come when we read Bill's story. We're going to find that when Bill worked what amounted to the 12 steps at that time, there were only 11. The 10th step had not been considered, and the reason for this, and we'll be talking about this in the future many times, the reason the 10th step was not included, there was no idea of a continuing personal inventory on a daily basis, was because the Oxford group, which was the primary religious teacher here, believed that once having worked the steps, people became perfect, and there was no need for any follow-on. Our guys found that that just simply wasn't true, that the world and all of its people would continue to threaten them and impinge upon them, and that therefore their character defects would keep cropping up and cropping up. They needed to have a way to deal with those on a daily basis, and also to deal with the harm they may cause to people as they went through life, and also to remind themselves it was necessary for them to constantly be aware of the needs of others. Therefore, out of all of this came the 10th step, which is the 4th step, the 5th step, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th steps all rolled into one step, plus a bridge over to the 12th step, and the admonition that love and tolerance of others is our code. So you see, all of these things came about as a matter of trial and error, because at the time that this book was written, they had just recently come to understand that this 10th step was necessary. In fact, when Bill wrote the 12 steps out for the big book, they had never been written out before. Nobody had ever put them in writing, and the 6 steps of the Oxford group were not in writing either. This was all by word of mouth. So when Bill sat down to write the big book, it became necessary for him to write out the steps. And when he got to the 9th step, he realized that they were all doing something here which wasn't in accord with the Oxford people at all, but that they had found it was necessary, and he identified that with what we now know as the 10th step, continuing personal inventory, so that nothing ever gets ahead of us. And he realized too that at night when they were doing what became the 11th step, they were going back through their day and checking it out, so there was another inventory. And none of this stuff I think was there when the Oxfordians got hold of them the first 3 years. And so you can see here, however, that the Oxford groups had given us most of the basics of the 12 steps: moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and necessity of belief in and dependence upon God. Yes?
Were there other things that he didn't agree with? It says there were some, it looks like there were several things that Bill didn't agree with.
Well, yeah, and they all revolved around the idea the Oxfordians had that somehow or another they reached a place of perfection.
Right.
And he believed that was not so. I mean, his experience, the experience of the others in the fellowship, except a few people in Akron, they wanted to hang on to the Oxford stuff for a few years later. But most people came to believe the Oxford The Oxford folks were off base, at least for alcoholics. They
So
didn't-
that thing with perfection and anything to do with that is
Yep.
what he didn't agree with?
Yep.
Okay.
That's right. Now then, it goes on to tell us that Bill had tried hard in those first 6 months to get anybody sober, and he hadn't been able to do that. They had taken his money and slept in his house and eaten his food. A couple times tried to burn his house down, but nobody got sober. And this was primarily, it wasn't that he didn't have a bunch of needy drunks out there, it was that he didn't know what he was doing. This was his first, and he just went out and decided that he needed to go out and carry the message, and he didn't know how to do it. Now in the second full paragraph on page Romans 16, XVI, the end of that paragraph, he suddenly realized that in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician. Bill had gotten quite desperate, and he had gone to Dr. Silkworth, and he had said to him, in effect, I've been trying all this time to get anybody sober. Some of these people have been your patients, and nobody's sober today. 6 months later, what's wrong? And so Dr. Silkworth told Bill that what he was doing, his approach was wrong, and he showed him how. He said, you got to first tell him how you drank, and how alcohol affected you, because look, you got to establish your bona fides with these people. They're going to have some faith and confidence in you. You're going to have to trust that you know what you're talking about. And so it's necessary for you to first tell them about your own drinking. Establish yourself as one with them so that they can then begin to identify with you. And then he said after that, you got to tell them what's wrong with them. Tell them about the disease that they're carrying. And then after that, then you can tell them how you recovered. And so when Dr. Bob and Bill got together in Akron, this was shortly after Bill's talk with Dr. Silkworth, this is what he did. He first sat Dr. Bob down and he told Dr. Bob how he drank and how it affected him and how he tried to stop and how he was powerless over it. And it worked. If it had not been for that, none of us would be here today. Because Bill was about to give up. He was ready to drink again. It's pretty scary to think about these. We had watershed events all along the way with AA. We sit in here fat, dumb, and happy, figuring that this has always been here. That's a bunch of baloney. AA is much younger than I am. And before there was an AA, there was nothing. There was no recovery. We were dead. There was nothing anybody could do for the chronic alcoholic. We were going to die. And a lot of us just went crazy. The alcohol was tearing us up. So when we look at it from that standpoint, we have to be ever grateful that Bill was guided, and God must seriously have wanted us to be here today. Because if he hadn't, this thing never would have gotten off the ground. So what happened then, and it talks about it here, the physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means. Now, Dr. Bob had tried everything, including the Oxford group, but he didn't understand that he had a disease. See, that's what turned him around. That's what made all of this possible. As Dr. Bob was a physician and they'd never been taught anything about alcoholism in medical school, all the doctors were of the opinion that alcoholism was an aberration of the mind and people were weak-willed or bad, and the religionists considered them to be minions and puppets of the devil, or just people who should be the butt of the jokes and hidden away. And at one time there were comedians who made their living pretending to be drunk, and I mean the laughing stock of the village, the town drunk, the one that everybody looked down on, and nobody understood that these were sick people. And Dr. Silkworth made it clear that they were sick and why, and we're going to get into that in a little while. Dr. Bob was convinced by Bill Wilson, because Bill had been schooled by Dr. Silkworth, that yes, indeed, he was ill. He had a disease. Now, once we identify alcoholism as a disease, now we can have some hope that there's a way to put a disease into remission. You see, because otherwise it's just this massive stuff out here, and it doesn't, and we're hopeless. We have no power over it. We can't stop. It's killing us, and we know that. And everybody tells us what rotten people we are, how little willpower we have. How could you possibly do that to this wonderful family of yours, and all that stuff. Frothy emotional appeal seldom suffices, Dr. Silkworth said. The message which will interest these alcoholic people must have depth and weight. And that's what this program supplies. Well, all of you guys know that because you've experienced it. Let's go down to the bottom of page 16, XVI. When the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. He sobered never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. This seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. It also indicated that the strenuous work one alcoholic with another was vital to permanent recovery. Please understand what we just read. It indicated that strenuous work one alcoholic with another was vital to permanent recovery. We do not get recovery sitting around bitching and moaning in meetings. That's not recovery in AA. AA is not Problems Anonymous. Here we have a solution. We have a solution. Let's look at the solution. When somebody comes to you as a sponsor and they start moaning and groaning with all their grief, listen for about 45 seconds, figure out what the problem is, and take them to the solution. Please. That's what we're here for. That's our job as sponsors. Not to sit there and be willing to be beaten around the head and shoulders for 45 minutes with somebody's problems. Now, the psychobabble idea is that we're supposed to vent all this stuff, and that's going to make us feel better. And it's a nice band-aid, and we probably do feel better for a little while, but that's not a solution. Make no mistake, that is not a solution. The solution is always a spiritual one, and it's up to us as sponsors to show that to our sponsees so that they begin to function on a different plane, a different level in their lives. And that different plane, that different level is a spiritual plane. Because the basic problem your sponsee has when they walk in that door is a spiritual problem. They're spiritually bankrupt. And the Big Book tells us the truth, that when the spiritual malady is overcome, we do straighten out mentally and physically. That's a promise, and it's the truth. Our job is to bring that truth to the new person, or to the person who's been around for a while and never learned. And none of this is something I made up. This is all in the book. And it all comes from experience. There's just no doubt that these things are true. Now then, Dr. Bob and Bill Wilson went over to the hospital in Akron, and they asked the hospital administrator to point out the worst drunk in the place. Turned out to be Bill Dodson. Bill was a lawyer. He was a bad drunk, and when he got drunk, he got violent, and they had him strapped down to his bed, and he'd already punched a couple of nurses out. They sat there for 2 days and talked to Bill Dodson. AA number 3 in the back of the book, by the way. You need to read his story because it's vital to the development of AA in those early days. Because these two guys went in there not knowing whether they were some kind of an odd situation that would never happen again. And they really worked at it. And they went in there and they talked to Bill for 2 solid days. And then finally, the night of that second day, Bill talked to his wife and he said, I think these guys have something. When they came in the next day, he surrendered. And he became AA number 3, never to drink again. He and Dr. Bob founded the first AA group in Akron. And then it just went on from there. Bill went back to New York and he would go into Towns Hospital and he'd say to Silkworth, Doctor, give me your worst case. And he'd have a couple of his guys with him. And they'd go into these chronic alcoholics that Silkworth had given up on. All they were trying to do with them then was keep them alive. They were going to have to discharge them soon because they couldn't do anything to help them. And Bill and his friends would go in either together or singly, and they would start talking to these hopeless, helpless cases. And Dr. Silkworth would be poking his head in every once in a while. And then he would notice something very strange. Here these guys would all have their heads bowed, and they'd be praying together. A couple days later, the hopeless, helpless case got up out of his deathbed and walked out of the hospital. And a month later, he was back, doing it for the next guy in line. Don't think Dr. Silkworth didn't learn from that? You see, he saw that there was a way for alcoholics to recover. And it was the way that these guys from AA were doing it. He saw it work. He saw it work with people he had given up on. All right, let's go to page Roman 27. That's Roman 17, XVII. Down at the bottom of that page, last full paragraph. There were now 3 groups in Akron, Cleveland, and New York. It was now time the struggling groups thought to place their message and unique experience before the world. This determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women. The fledgling society, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. The flying blind period ended and AA entered into a new phase of its pioneering time. Notice that the name of this fellowship is taken from the name of this book, and the name of this book was about the 4th or 5th choice down the line. They had a lot of other names for the book to begin with, but they found out that other publications out there already used those names. So they ended up with Alcoholics Anonymous. And then and because it was the way it was printed right on the front of the book, the fellowship became known as Alcoholics Anonymous. It was not until this book was published that name was used, yes.
What they call themselves before the book?
The Way Out.
Yep. Yep.
The Way Out?
The Way Out.
And it was number 13 when they went into the library, and they didn't want to be number 13, so that's how this book came in.
That's right, exactly.
Oh.
The Way Out.
Excuse me, can you explain it? Can you say it again about the 13?
There were 13 books called The Way Out when they went into research shoot, and they didn't want to be number 13, so that's how we got the name of Alcohol.
The Way Out.
The Way Out.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. That's good.
And then when Bill published by Multilith the original manuscript, they'd already adopted the name Alcoholics Anonymous. Any of you ever seen that original manuscript?
I got a copy of it.
You got a copy? You're going up to Ohio?
Yes.
When you go to Akron, you can get a copy of it there, of the original manuscript that Bill wrote before the big book was published, and it's very different from this
Do
book.
they sell it on the web or no?
Or like Dr. Bob.
No, I don't. You might be able to pick it up by mail, but it's way too big to be. You're not going to try to copy it from the web. See, what's out there right now are copies of a multilith. Multilith was pretty much the same as mimeograph, but it was a little different process. And those copies are around now. The copy that's around here in Florida was Clarence Snyder's copy. Clarence Snyder is in the big book as the brewmeister. And he lived here in Florida. He was the last person alive of the original group that edited the big book. So a copy of that original manuscript is floating around here. That may be what
that's
you
what I
have.
got.
That's what Tommy has. We could. It's pretty. A lot of the pages are pretty dim. It's very. It could be done. It could be reproduced if you had some really powerful equipment. It'll probably have to be run through a computer. But you can pick up copies. And it's very, very interesting to read what Bill originally wrote. You've seen that, haven't you, Carol? Yeah. Okay. Then it talks about what happened after the book was written and how we got approval from Fosdick. Fosdick, by the way, there's a volume out of Fosdick's sermons, and it's amazing how they just almost dovetail with AA, and those sermons I think went back to about 1920. So when Fosdick read the big book, he said, yes, this is right. Then Liberty Magazine published an article called Alcoholics and God. This is on page 18, XVII. Then came the publication in the Saturday Evening Post of Jack Alexander's article. Now, if you want a copy of that, there is a pamphlet that has the Jack Alexander article reprinted in full. So if you don't have it with your group, you might ask whoever handles ordering the pamphlets, try to get a couple copies of it next time you order pamphlets. It's an extremely interesting article because Jack Alexander in 1941 had a real handle on AA. It's amazing just how clear he was. You read that, didn't you, Tom? You read that? Yeah, when first time I read that, I said, this guy really did his research. He knew what he was talking about. Well, that article was in the Saturday Evening Post, which was an extremely influential magazine in those days, and all of a sudden they just be deluged with inquiries. They had their little office in New York, and they were swamped. And there was a period of time when AA was either going to rise or fall. One of the things they did was they set up the Board of Trustees, which is now the World Service Office, but the Board of Trustees were non-alcoholics and alcoholics, and they took over all the money and all that stuff, and established in many ways the bona fides of the fellowship in terms of the rest of the world. Now on page 19, XIX, there's a very interesting paragraph here which really lays out the traditions. Let's see what it says. As we discovered the principles by which the individual alcoholic could live, so we had to evolve principles by which the AA groups and AA as a whole could survive and function effectively. Please notice that the traditions are called principles. It's important for your sponsee to understand that the steps are principles and the traditions are principles. It was thought that no alcoholic man or woman could be excluded from our society, that our leaders might serve but never govern, that each group was to be autonomous and there was to be no professional class of therapy. There were to be no fees or dues. Our expenses were to be met by our own voluntary contributions. There was to be the least possible organization, even in our service centers. Our public relations were to be based upon attraction rather than promotion. It was decided that all members ought to be anonymous at the level of press, radio, TV, and films. And in no circumstances should we give endorsements, make alliances, or enter into public controversies. Isn't that a neat paragraph? I mean, you could show this to your sponsee. They got the 12 traditions sitting right there in front of them. It gives you a good opportunity to discuss the traditions with them right there. This was the substance of AA's 12 traditions, which are stated in full, page 564. Though none of these principles had the force of rules or laws, they had become so widely accepted by 1950 that they were confirmed by our first international conference held at Cleveland. Today, the remarkable unity of AA is one of the greatest assets that our society has. So this tells your sponsee and tells you, if you haven't read this before, that the traditions in their form that we now call the short form were adopted by the First International in 1950. But it's important to see that these principles were already being developed as far back as the time that the original Big Book was written. And then it talks about the growth of AA, and there's something interesting here at the top of page 20, XX. 5 lines down. Of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried. See, that's the modifier here. You got to remember that. Otherwise, this sentence could be misleading. 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered up after some relapses. And among the remainder, those who stayed on with AA showed an improvement. Now, it's important to understand what this is saying. Really tried means that they were working the steps. At least we're trying to work the steps, which, if you look around the rooms today, half the people you're looking at haven't even begun to work their steps. And a lot of them have no intention of doing so. And they're believing what they're hearing, that all it requires to stay sober is just don't drink and go to meetings.
Clean ashtrays.
Clean ashtrays and make coffee, yeah. Be a greeter at the door. Absolutely, that's what's going to work. That's service, right? See, that's service to the group. Service in AA is the 12 steps. Service to the group is something entirely different. It may make you feel like you belong. It may make you feel better and feel good. But this, Alcoholics Anonymous is not about feel good. This is one of the big myths that we have to play with all the time around here. It's not about feel good. It's about spiritual recovery. It's about carrying a spiritual message. It's about surrender to God. It's about seeking God's knowledge of God's will and being willing to do it. That's what this is about. It's not about feel good. The feel good part comes about naturally from following directions and from doing God's will. But sponsors who are intent upon constantly making sure that their sponsees feel good are missing the boat, and many times it's devastating to them, because it means they don't face the realities in their life. They don't face the realities in their psyche and in their spiritual deficiencies, because they're so intent upon feeling good that they never really get down to causes and conditions. Yes, John.
These numbers they got here, 50%, 25%, where'd they get it if it's an anonymous program? Where'd they get these numbers?
Well,
Is it a guesstimation? Or?
it always has to be, because, for example, if you were to look around this club and look at the various, let's say there are 80 people in a meeting, and they ask for members of the group, and 4 people put their hand up. Now, a lot of the people belong to other groups, but a lot of people don't even belong to a group. They just attend meetings here. They have no group affiliation at all. Any census of AA is bound to be off by a wide margin. Not only that, but if you take a census today, it's going to be wrong tomorrow. In fact, you take it at 10 o'clock in the morning, it's going to be wrong by 11 o'clock in the morning. So yes, it's an estimate, and so we're looking at numbers which are probably pretty close to being right, say within a plus or minus 15%, 10%, 15%. And they err on the low side, because there are a heck of a lot more people around than ever would show up on any kind of a census. A lot more. We know, for example, that 5 years ago when they took a census, they found about 4 million people who were members of groups. And we're talking now at least 5 million. There were probably 5 million then who were in recovery. But there's no way to know. So these numbers are approximations. But you got a little bit better handle on the people who stick around than you do of the vast majority of people who just wander through and don't stick. Because it seems that about 1 out of 10 who come in the door actually stay around long enough to really get sober. And a lot of people who come in the door will be coming in the door on and off for the next 20 years. Some will be for the next 4 or 5 years. Some we'll never see again. So, you just don't know how that's going to work out. But of the people who stick, a large number recover. And the reason for that is what Dr. Bob said in his story. He's talking about the program of the 12 steps. He said it never fails. But there's a big proviso. Provided you go about it with 1/2 the zeal you used to go about getting your next drink. So it's really a question always of the effort that's put in. Never forget when you're teaching the steps to your sponsees, everything in this book, everything in the steps has to do with the work we do, the effort we expend. So, nothing else will do it. As it says after the promises, remember, they always materialize if we work for them. Chapter 5 is how it works. Chapter 6 is into action. Chapter 7 is working with others. There isn't anything about this program which is amenable to sitting around wishing for it to happen. There's nothing about this program which is going to come true by simply going to meetings, unless you're going to meetings where you actually work in the steps. There are a few like that, but not many. There's nothing about this program that works unless you've got individuals working with each other. Somebody who's been there before working with somebody who's not. That's why we're all here, guys. It doesn't make a particle of difference whether you're called sponsor or not. What it makes the difference is that you're willing to work and self-sacrifice for other people. That's how you guarantee your own recovery, and you guarantee that you're doing God's work and you're living up to the mission that you've been given, which is to be of maximum service to God and the people about you. That's the way we stay sober around here.
How far do you go?
What do you mean?
If somebody comes and asks you, would you sponsor me?
You say yes.
They're like, yeah, that's part of the way. Well, how about they're aloof, they don't want to work the program, they just want you to be their sponsor.
Look at page 96.
They don't take suggestions.
Look at page 96.
That's right. Waste your time.
9-6. The first full paragraph, the middle of the paragraph, right in the middle of that first paragraph. To spend too much time on any one situation is to deny some other alcoholic an opportunity to live and be happy. One of our fellowship failed entirely with his first half-dozen prospects. He often says that if he had continued to work on them, he might have deprived many others who have since recovered of their chance. This requires of us, John, that we use some sense about it. There's nothing here which gives you an absolute guide as to when you back away from somebody. But if they're not willing to, here's the way I do it. You guys don't have to follow this, just my own method, but it works for me. When I get somebody new, what I say to them, some of you people in here know this. Here's the deal. I'm going to tell you what to do, and you're going to do it without dragging your feet, without any excuses, and you're just going to get busy and get the work done. And I promise you that if you do that, I'll show you every step of the way exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. You'll find that the directions are all here in the book. And if we have that agreement, and if we both follow through on it, I promise you that you will be just fine. And that's the agreement we have. And anyone who's supposedly working with me who's refused to do that, I tell them, look, I can't help you. And I'd be glad to continue to advise you from time to time or to help you. And if you ever decide you really want to get to work, let me know. But I got too many people out there who want to help. And I'm not going to waste my time on somebody who doesn't. That's the way I look at it. But you see, it's very important when you have expectations of somebody, let them know right up front what they are. And my expectations of people who are working with me is that they're going to do the work. I'm going to tell them what to do, and they're going to do it. Because I don't believe any of these directions are suggestions. I believe that the suggestion is that we follow directions. Now then, the question is, are you willing to follow directions or not? The suggestion is that you do. Same the suggestion I'd make to you if you jumped on an airplane. I suggest you pull a ripcord. And it's up to you. You're falling down, you see the ground rushing up, what are you going to do? Follow directions. Okay. So that's what I do. I mean, you guys, there's no hard and fast rules about this, but I've taken over 2,000 people through the steps. So when I share something with you, at least I can tell you that in my experience it works. Okay? All righty. Down on page 20 again now. The second full paragraph, 2/3 of the way down the page. This is XX, page XX. Alcoholics Anonymous is not a religious organization. Neither does AA take any particular medical point of view, though we cooperate widely with men of medicine as well as the men of religion. Alcohol is no respecter of persons. We are an accurate cross-section of America and in distant lands. The same democratic evening up process is now going on. By personal religious affiliation, we include Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Hindus, and a sprinkling of Muslims and Buddhists. More than 15% of us are women. Oh, God. How'd we ever let them in here? I'm a born-again chauvinist, I admit it. At present, our membership is pyramiding at the rate of about 20% a year. So far, upon the total problem of several million actual and potential alcoholics in the world, we have made only a scratch. In all probability, we shall never be able to touch more than a fair fraction of the alcohol problem and all its ramifications. Upon therapy for the alcoholic himself, we surely have no monopoly. It is our great hope that all those who have as yet found no answer may begin to find one on the page of this book and will presently join us on the high road to a new freedom. Now that was in 1955. Now on the next page over, we come to 1976. Forward to the third edition. By March of 1976, when this edition went to the printer, the total worldwide membership of Alcoholics Anonymous was conservatively estimated at more than 100,000, with almost 28,000 groups meeting in over 90 countries.
It's 1 million.
1 million. Did I say 1 million? Oh. Well,
Close.
I also may not have slept the tongue today, and I'll tell you, it's just having senior moments, so please forgive me. More than 1 million with about 28,000 groups meeting in over 90 countries. Now, John, we have an accurate count on the groups because they do register with New York. Surveys of groups in the United States and Canada indicate that AA is reaching out not only to more and more people, but to a wider and wider range. Now, as of today, we're looking at AA in something like 138 countries. And the big book has been translated into 27 foreign languages. And the interesting thing is that today, and they're in the process of translating the big book into Mayan, because the Mayan tongue is so prevalent in Central America. And we've got a lot of people down there. 7% of AAs surveyed are less than 30 years of age. 1/4 of the membership are women. Oh, I think that's they've gone up from 15% to 25%. It's probably 35% now, and they're taking over. God, what a revolting development. They used to keep the women up, just lock them up or deny that there was a problem. Didn't you ever see a woman go down on her morning visit to the store and come back with a bag with a head of celery hanging out over the top of the bag like this?
That was for the Bloody Marys.
Yeah. That's a good.
And nestled up next to it was her bottle.
There you go.
Been there, done that.
Get home and the celery goes down the garbage disposal and the vodka goes down the gullet.
This is true.
Okay, the 12 steps that summarize the program may be called Los Dos Pasos or Los 12 Etapes in another, but they trace exactly the same path to recovery, listen to this, that was blazed by the earliest members of Alcoholics Anonymous. In spite of the great increase in the size and span of this fellowship, at its core it remains simple and personal. Now listen to this. Each day, somewhere in the world, recovery begins when one alcoholic talks with another alcoholic, sharing experience, strength, and hope. Ultimately, this is going to have to happen even for those who spend 28, 40, 130 days in a treatment center. Ultimately, it comes down to one alcoholic sharing experience, strength, and hope with another. And that's our job. That's why we're here. That's what we're learning to do. Now then, let's go over to the next. By the way, if you have the 4th edition of the big book, and a lot of you do, there's another forward, and you can check that out for yourself. It has some interesting stuff in it. I don't happen to have it here, so we're not going to talk about it. If that sounds a little pompous, I'm sorry. The doctor's opinion is on in your new edition, it's on page 25, XXV. In the 3rd edition, XXII. XXIII, 23. The reason for that, of course, is that the forward to the 4th edition was inserted at this point. This changes the page numbering for everything in the italicized portion of the big book. Now here's the first, a little background on this. When they first began to write the book, they asked Silkworth to come up with a letter kind of recommending them as being good people to talk to if you wanted to recover from alcoholism. So here's what he said. I've specialized in the treatment of alcoholism for many years. And by the way, he was director of Towns Hospital, probably the major recovery hospital for alcohol and drug addiction in the world. In late 1934, I attended a patient who, though he had been a competent businessman of good earning capacity, was an alcoholic of a type I had come to regard as hopeless. Actually, this was Bill's last time in the hospital. He'd been there twice before, and Dr. Silkworth had gotten to know him at those times. In late 1934 was Bill's last time in the hospital, And when we get to Bill's story, which is the next chapter, you're going to tell us about that and how that came about. He goes on to say, in the course of his third treatment, he acquired certain ideas concerning a possible means of recovery. Those were the ideas which were given to Bill by Ebby, which were the program of recovery of the Oxford group. As part of his rehabilitation, he commenced to present his conceptions to other alcoholics, impressing upon them that they must do likewise with still others. Now, this is the result. What happened when Bill was in the hospital, and we get to his story, we're going to read all about this, but Bill he was inspired to believe that he was going to have to carry this message to others in order to recover himself. And so this is what he was doing. Dr. Silkworth said as a part of his rehabilitation. Actually, what Bill had come to understand was that it was not rehabilitation, it was life and death. Because what he actually says is that if an alcoholic fails or refuses to enlarge and perfect his spiritual life through work and self-sacrifice for others, he can't survive. Going on, Dr. Silkworth says, this has become the basis of a rapidly growing fellowship of these men and their families. Notice that this is what he's talking about here, presenting conceptions to other alcoholics and pressing upon them that they must do likewise with still others. Still again, guys, it's one-on-one. The basis of sponsorship must be one-on-one. We cannot slough off our obligation to teach and to share with other people other than one-on-one. It isn't enough to send people to meetings. If we're not going to do it one-on-one, if we're not going to be there and be willing to take the time and effort to do this, then stop trying to be a sponsor, because it isn't going to work. This man and over 100 others appear to have recovered. Says, I personally know scores of cases who were of the type with whom other methods had failed completely. And the reason he knows these scores of cases, guys, is because they came out of his hospital. See, this was 3 years later. And this is when Dr. Silkworth had been seeing what was happening when these guys had come in and worked with his hopeless cases. Scores of others. These facts appear to be of extreme medical importance because of the extraordinary possibilities of rapid growth inherent in this group. They may mark a new epoch in the annals of alcoholism. These men may well have a remedy for thousands of such situations. Little did he know that as you and I read this, it's millions, not just of alcoholics, but addicts, people with eating problems, and people with emotional problems, and people with sexual problems, and people with mental problems, and all across the board. I think there's even a group now called Nose Pickers Anonymous. That's a joke. We're coming to that. Now then, wouldn't you love to have this said about you? What a great epitaph. You may rely absolutely on anything they say about themselves. What is he saying? He's saying you may rely absolutely on what's in this book. Because what is this book? It's all about them. And Dr. Silkworth is saying you may rely absolutely on anything they say about themselves. That's one of the greatest encomiums I've ever seen or heard from anybody. And he doesn't make any bones about it either, because he knew that these guys were deadly serious, that they had experienced what they wrote about, that this book contains those experiences without exaggeration, without inserting anybody's philosophy. Remember what Bill said about AA? He said nobody invented AA. He said it just grew by the grace of God. And Bill knew where he got all this stuff. He knew it came from a higher power. All right. Next week we will get into the doctor's opinion, and after that we'll begin our study of Bill's story, chapter 1. And if you're reading ahead, you might want to check those out a little bit. Over and over and over again, the more you read this, the more you'll see. This big book is so dense that a lifetime of reading and studying it is not sufficient to entirely learn everything that's in here. But what we can do is we can become more and more familiar with it. And when we find out how all the stuff ties together, and then we begin to see all the patterns and the connections. And it's incredible what this book is. You never know it by a cursory reading. Yeah.
Just had a question that says, he had been a competent businessman of good earning and capacity. Was an alcoholic of a type I had become come to regard as hopeless. Did they have different types of alcoholics then? Did they think differently than they do today?
Well, no, really not. He believed that once having reached a certain point, an alcoholic became chronic or hopeless. And having passed over that line, there was nothing more they could do to help. What he did not realize at that time was that his hospital was filled with many people who drank too much, but were not alcoholic. And for them, he could often help them, because they could stop on their own too if they had sufficient reason for doing it. But for the real alcoholics, he had no remedy. And the term alcoholic is applied to anybody who drinks too much or who's not able or appears not to be able to control their drinking, or where alcohol interferes in some major aspect of their lives. They can be labeled as alcoholics. We get them all the time in here, all kinds of people in AA who don't need AA. They just needed a good reason to stop drinking. And they stick around because it's a wonderful place to be. They get all kinds of attention and love and get a lot of satisfaction. They have lots of friends, and they get to be gurus. They get to stay around long enough that they got 20, 30 years, and everybody thinks they must be absolutely the most knowledgeable people in the world about recovery. And the fact is, they never need to be here in the first place. And these are the dangerous ones because they often get up and talk about, I didn't have to read the big book, I didn't have to work the steps, I just didn't drink, and I came to meetings. And for those of us, and this means everybody in this room, chronic alcoholic can't get away with that. We're going to die because the first step is right. We're powerless over alcohol. And the only way we're going to recover is to get God between us and the booze. See, that's our job as sponsors, is to see to it that our sponsees use these steps in such a way, by following directions, that they interpose a loving God between them and booze. Then they recover. That makes sense? All right. Tonight we have our step meeting at 7:30. You're all cordially invited to be back with us. We're going to be doing the fifth step tonight. And at 9:15 we will have our traditions meeting. We're going to be on tradition 9 tonight. I'd love to have any of you here who would like to be with us on that. These are also meetings of the Stairway Group, by the way. Another thing, I'd like to invite any of you who would like to be members of our group. Give your name to Marilyn. We want you. We don't care if you're a member of 10 other groups. We want you as a member of our group too, because our membership is people from all over South Florida, from South Dade, and even from the Keys, and from Palm Beach County, and from West Broward, from all over Dade County. So the Stairway Group is for everybody who's truly interested, as you guys are, in the steps in the big book, in God, recovery, and the truth about all these things as it comes from the book and from experience. And so we're all of a like mind. And believe me, there are a hell of a lot more people who care about these things than you may realize. And our Stairway Group is absolute proof of that. the fact that you guys are all sitting here is proof of that. On a Saturday afternoon, come on. But I've been doing this for 14 years, and this sponsorship workshop, and I'm telling you, this is by far and away the best group I've ever had. And I'm delighted that you're all here, and I'm praying that all of you will be interested enough in this, get enough out of it that you'll stick it out and come to as many of these sessions as you can, because I promise you that you will end up having a far better and more successful sponsorship role than you could ever have otherwise without many, many years of experience, because we can crowd all that experience into these 35 weeks. You'll have confidence that you know how to teach the steps. You'll have confidence that you know how to teach the big book and how to deal with people out there. And it's a pretty valuable experience, I think. Anything else? Anybody have any announcements they'd like to make? Well, Marilyn, are we ready to close?
We are.
Let's close. Let this circle represent the unity of our fellowship. A moment of silence for those who are still suffering. And then we'll say the Lord's Prayer together. And please remember that in the stairway group we don't say anything after we say amen. Thank you. Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Thanks all for being here. Please, 2 or 3 of you stick around and help. Please stick around, a couple of people, and help Marilyn get this place cleaned up. You know what we could do is we could see, a group conscience can be taken at any time. So we need an assistant treasurer for the stairway group. This is part of the stairway group, by the way. I think we mentioned that last week. We have 3 meetings on Saturday, right here. This meeting, 7:30 step meeting, and a 9:15 tradition meeting. It's all at the stairway group. Marilyn is the treasurer of that group, but we need an assistant treasurer. So if there's no problem with that, we'll go ahead and elect one right now. Who is a volunteer to be assistant treasurer? Who comes to all of our meetings, or most of them? Okay. Anyone else?
John.
What?
I don't trust him, man. Just look at him.
All right. All right.
Pardon me?
So he said, would I like to be assistant treasurer? I'll do it.
Okay.
We have a new system.
I think that's
So
really
we take the
treasurer's.
money that we make that night and we try to double it at the ratio.
Oh, assistant treasurer, I'll do both.
Check the qualifications over here too.
Yeah, check his qualifications. He's from Philadelphia.
How you doing?
Well, I didn't think no one else was going to volunteer.
Oh, come on.
John was probably.
Ping pong, that's not even, meet people.
We got anyone else who would like the job?
Oh.
All right, you two get to step outside for a second. Oh,
We're going to take an election.
we're going to have an election right now.
John too, right?
Huh?
3 of them go outside.
Yeah.
You, him, and her.
He doesn't even know what you just
Oh, they got,
nominated.
they got, I don't need it, I mean,
No, you're one of the electorals. You have to go out now.
I know that, but if you got other people that volunteered,
No, we want to take that.
We can't have an election
We
with
want
one
an
person.
election.
Oh, yeah, we can. We can,
We
by
gotta have a
acclamation.
choice, is what it is.
Come on, let's get straightened out here, guys. Who wants the job? There we go.
All
All right. That's a guy.
Nice shot.
Keith?
The guy with the white shirt on.
Huh?
Him and her.
All right, all in favor of him? 1, 2, 3. All in favor of her? Excuse me, slip. Okay, it's her.
Man, you guys are prejudiced. Hear that?
I abstained.
Come on in, guys.
All right.
There's our new assistant treasurer right there. Thank
Kathy Maryland. All right.
you. Make a note of that, will you, Marilyn? And
Yes.
remind me to announce it tonight.
Yes, I will.
And we expect you at the meeting tonight.
I'll be here.
You're
All right.
a great guy.
How will we know when the following day?
Okay, the following week I will.
Do we have anyone here with us today who's just coming back from having been out improving their resume? Anyone who's new? Anyone who is visiting from out of town? Anyone who's in their first workshop meeting? And Tim?
My name's Tim.
Hey Tim, we're glad you're here. Yes.
Lisa.
Hey Lisa. We have the 4-step guides. Got a few copies of them here.
John, for just 1 second.
John.
Borrow.
Me?
Yeah.
Me, John?
Yes, John.
You borrow me?
Your name's John and your name's borrowed.
Maryland has these. They're just to defray our cost on them for $1 a piece. That's a complete story on how to work a 4-step.
Hey, Vanna.
And it's the same thing that we teach in here. So when we get to 4-step, if you haven't picked one up yet, you may want to get one at that time. And it's customary and traditional in this group to read a portion of chapter 5 from the big book. Who's going to do that for us today?
I'm an alcoholic. My name's Jeff.
Hey, Jeff.
Hi. Rarely have we seen a person fail when they're swimming to our past. Those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to a simple program. Usually men and women are constantly capable of being honest with themselves. There are such unfortunates they are not alcoholics and they've been born that way. They are naturally capable of grasping and developing the men living, which demands to be responsible. The chances are less than higher. There are those too who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. Our stories disclose in a general way what we used to be like, what happened, and what we're like now. If you have decided you want what we have and are willing to go every night to get it, then you're ready to take certain steps. At some things we balked. We thought we could find an easier, softer way, but we could not. Following this is that our command, we beg of you to be fearlessly thorough from the very start. Some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result is no, let go, absolutely. Remember that we deal with alcohol, coming back with powerful. Without helping is too much for us. There is one who has all power, that one is God, and may you find him now. Half measures avail us nothing. We sit at the turning point. They ask his protection, care, and complete abandon. Here are steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery. 1. We admit we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanaged. 2. Thankfully that a power greater than ourselves could restore us as head. 3. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood it. 4. Made a searching and fearless more inventory of ourselves. 5. Admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6. Learned how to ready to have God use all these new types of character. 7. Humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. 8. Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. 9. Made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so with incidental others. 10. Continued to take personal inventory when we were wrong and properly admitted it. 11. Sought to prepare an application to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood it. Pray only the knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. 12. Having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to alcoholics and practice these principles in all our affairs. Many of us explain what an order, capable of proving it. Do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. We are not saints. The point is that we are willing to go along spiritual lines.